Good afternoon, friends. Thank you for coming this afternoon. Thank you for coming today. I really appreciate it. I want to begin because I know that we have a lot to do today. We know there's more after this, and I want to honor the time that we have together. I want to just start off by saying that every time I have an opportunity to engage with people, it's kind of a creative process. I change things, I move things, it's not always linear. I'm going to do some things differently today than I've done before. There may be moments where I fast forward. And so we'll just go with the flow and see what happens. I know that you saw me all with a t-shirt that said, "Our radical imagination sets us free." I have a different one in this moment. I am so not about the prison system, but it's like way past time. This guy's got to go. And, you know, we'll talk more about that as we go on. So this training, Escalating Resistance, Mass Rebellion Training, I originally created because I'm doing a lot of work now with an emerging group called Extinction Rebellion. Anybody here know about Extinction Rebellion? Yep. And I want to say that I also understand that this is a really important emerging movement, but there are people that have been working for generations, particularly indigenous nations, that have been the stewards of this land from the beginning. And that there are many other organizations and groups that have been fighting for environmental justice, now climate justice. And so Extinction Rebellion, I understand, walks in a long lineage of people that have come before. And I think it's really important that we remember that, because so often when we're the new kid on the block, we can take on a lot of energy about we are the ones. And I want to both honor that energy, but also know that if we don't remember what has come before, or we just go out there and roll over other groups, we have the potential of cutting off part of the resource of all of us that we need. So, but really what this workshop is about, and sometimes it's very interactive in the ground, but I'm going to have to cut some of that today. It's not a traditional direct action training. I'm trying to, what I like to say is ignite your imagination of what is possible based on what some folks have done before. Because I think one of the biggest questions for all of us right now, as we look around the world and see uprising after uprising after uprising, where is our uprising? And what is it going to take to get there? Were any of you here yesterday for the panel around Black Lives Matter and the young folks who organized that? Zoe in particular over here, I know. Woohoo! Because it was awesome. It was an awesome, important space to hear from people of color about their struggles. And I asked a question about uprising and solidarity. And some of the information, or sort of the response was that, yes, we need to have uprisings like we had in Seattle. But it's that long-term organizing that happens before that's going to also determine what comes out afterwards. And so it's never either or, which is a manifestation of white supremacist culture, this idea that it is either or. It's always and both. And so, when we have this sense of like extinction and urgency, we need to remember that babies all around this planet have faced extinction in communities that have been under attack, and some survive, right? There have been many species that have survived or come back. And so the future, while it looks bleak, is not written. What will happen is based on what we do today. So when I talk about radical, right, does that word scare anybody? I know I'm in the right crowd. But in this culture, that word radical is used against us all the time. And it's used to create fear. But when we talk about being radical or radical changes, what is it that what is radical? The roots, going to the roots, right? And so I'm going to spend a little time going to some of the roots as we go through this time together today. But I want you all to just close your eyes for a minute and think about what is the most radical thing you have ever done. And I just want to also be clear that radical does not necessarily mean protesting or protecting things in the streets. So just think for a minute about what's the most radical thing you've ever done. And now I want you to turn to somebody next to you and briefly share your radical act. And I want you to also think about this. I should have said it before I've got you at this point, but life happens. How did you feel before that radical act? And how did you feel after that radical act? So just take a few minutes. Maybe one of you can speak first, the other can listen, that active listening thing. Because you'll have a chance to tell your story too. So just take like 2 minutes to share your radical act. Did anybody hear a story about a radical action or a radical act that somebody did that was found very powerful? And with consent, I'd like to hear maybe 2 or 3 stories about what you heard someone else say. But you check with them first if it's okay to share it. I'm going to start right here, and then I'm going to go to you, and then I'm going to come over here to Rick. Go ahead. Yep. Can you stand up so people can hear and see you?
Hi, my name is Lauren, and Michael here set up a Thar Piece to occupy
Okay, I've been hearing about those Thar Pieces. Pretty amazing. Yeah, awesome. Anything else with that?
Yeah, just that like initially he felt like it was fear, but then on the other side, just like, just happiness and exactly.
And Michael, you want to say anything about that for yourself?
I would never change my decision after doing it. I feel fearless.
Wow, never change your decision after doing it. Felt fearless. Thank you for sharing that story. Okay, in the back, the paintress.
Meg had her baby at home.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Woohoo! That, no drugs. Okay, awesome. Awesome. Radical acts. And then right here?
I got permission from Daniel to share what we shared this morning, which was like, I said, where were you on that day 20 years ago? And he said, I was in Chiapas.
Ah.
And what he shared with me, I can't say without crying, so it's just clear. He said, they kept showing me what was going on, and they said, look at what they're doing in the mouth of the wolf. Mouth of the wolf.
Wow.
And so those of us who were there know that's our key.
Thank you. So there's generally some universal feelings about what happens before we engage in radical acts. Anybody share with me what those feelings are? Righteous anger. Fear. That anybody felt fear before they did their act? Right, kind of universal. But afterwards, more fear. Elated, grounded, empowered, solidarity. Right. Yep. One of my teachers, Starhawk, always says, where there's fear, there's power. It's both sides makes the whole. Right. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about fear later on, but when we are willing to go through our fears, which is essential when we're facing what we're facing, there is something more positive on the other side, generally speaking. Okay, so one of the biggest ways that people give up their power is believing that they don't have any. Now, why are you all doing what you're doing? Love? Humanity? Responsibility of being alive. Vision. Desperation and survival. So are any of you doing this because you want more power? People. I mean, we're taught to believe that power is a negative thing. Right? We are. But what is power? How is power defined? Right. The ability to act. Nothing more, nothing less. But what we see is that there are certain people that we believe have power who are not exercising it in the way that we would want. So I actually think that when we talk about the roots, the primary thing we have to understand that is the dynamics of power that are underlying everything that we're actually dealing with. And again, in my, and I just want to say, there's no such thing as original idea. I'm just one of many channels that's trying to share with you things that I've learned from people before me. And I've also begun to realize more and more that each movement brings a certain wisdom to the fore, and that there are times where a lot is coming through. And I really believe that right now is a time where a lot of wisdom is coming through to all of us, and I'm just one of many channels trying to bring it forward. But I do, I've always felt like a lot of my work is helping people reclaim their power. But as some of you all said, there's different types of power. Right? There's the power, and again, I'm not the creator of this concept of power over, which is the power of the dominant culture, which is that power where we all believe that we are supposed to be what somebody else wants us to be, our parents, the teachers, the pastors, the doctors, whatever. So we're living a lot of our lives trying to be something that we may not be. There's power with, which is what we're building, that collective power, right? It's my belief, it's that power of the horizontal networks, the same kind of networks we use to shut down the WTO. There's power within. Every single one of us has power to change the world. That's that life force, that sacred force. And it's that is the force that they try so hard to kill. And there's power under. And that's really where we generally live. I got a bunch of people arrested once, and it was like 2 o'clock in the morning, and I went into the 7-Eleven to pee. I said, "Can I use the bathroom?" And he said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, there's no public restroom." I said, "I didn't ask if there was a public restroom. I asked if I could use the bathroom right there." And he said, "Sorry, ma'am, you can't." I said, "Wait a minute. Let's be clear. I could, but you're afraid of what your boss will say at 2 o'clock in the morning and they're not even here." He's like, "You're right. Use the bathroom." But as I look at that story even more, I think to myself, why did I even ask? So I really learned to just pay attention to myself, that whenever I say I can't do something, it's really because I'm afraid of something that might happen. So when we understand that power is relational, it's this dance. It's the dance in the streets when people are rising up in their own power that's contesting the reality of our conditions. Because I think a lot of what we're doing is trying to change the conditions in which we live. So when I think about the building blocks of change, the very first thing I think about is understanding these dynamics of power, because they're playing out around us all the time. And if we're not cognizant of how they are operating, we're going to miss a big part of how we need to be organizing. And those power over, power with, power within, and power under. So as I continued on my work of organizing, I was born in the South, in Georgia, was raised in the North, and I always knew at some level in my body that racism was doing harm. I didn't really fully understand it as a kid, but I knew something wasn't right. But as I got older and started to learn more and more about this, because every single movement that I've ever been involved in, I've seen torn apart by racism. And so I made a decision that I was going to work on racism for a while. And in my home community of Austin, we began doing these trainings called Undoing Racism by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. And PSAB has had a huge impact here in Seattle. Many trainers here, it's impacted the city government, and we took some lessons from Seattle, and we continued to organize in Austin. And I'll tell you something, we are seeing radical change. And a lot of what that radical change is that those of us, no matter what our age, what our race, what our gender, are having a common analysis, a common language, a common understanding of history, so that when we talk and strategize, we're meeting each other. Because right now, if I was to ask every single one of you in this room to define racism, I bet you I would get a different definition from all of you. There might be some similarities. But as long as we are not understanding what this dynamic of power is, we're going to miss each other. So back to the roots. This is an image that was put together by Rupa Marya, who was working with the Close the Camps in San Francisco's Extinction Rebellion group. And we know, particularly those of you that are on this land, understand the legacy of colonization. You know, when we were becoming two-leggeds, we started getting wired in a certain way, and at some point, we created something called civilization. And it was during that era of civilization that humans separated ourselves from nature. That was the first level of separation. We know in the cosmology of Christianity was another level of separation between Adam and Eve. We know from the founding of so many of these settler colonial states that those with wealth were separated from those without wealth. And all of these forms of separation or supremacy have led to nothing, and capitalism as well, have led to trauma, nothing but trauma. What's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. I truly believe that as we go forward into a new decade, right, because we are on the verge of a new decade, and change happens in cycles, and you can see patterns over decades, that we have to figure out how to be radically different. And yes, we need to organize, we need to take creative action, we need to shut shit down, we need to do all that stuff. But if we don't deal with this, and if we don't deal with the healing of the trauma that is created, we are going to continue to perpetuate all of this, and our movements will continue to be divided. And this, for me, is one of the most important lessons and wisdom coming through for new movements that are starting, particularly Extinction Rebellion. Because white supremacy, all supremacies, teach us about, there's one way, it's my way, it's the right way, we have to take action, we have to do all this stuff. And we can roll over people and histories. And if we do that now, we're not going to create anything new. Which is partially why also Extinction Rebellion in the US, which I'm so proud of, has created that fourth demand. Because we recognize that, yes, we need a transition. But if the transition isn't rooted in justice and the rights of Mother Nature and reparations, we may get to a more sustainable world and people will still be getting screwed. We can't keep doing that. So one of the things that we're gifted with from the wisdom is an understanding of trauma and how it works in our neurology. I bet you guys didn't come here thinking you were going to learn about trauma, did you? Well, if you're going to do direct action and face the state and face the fear that it brings upon us and the harm and the fact that they will kill us, we've got to deal with the trauma in order to stay in the streets and to be resilient. So part of the neurology that they've learned is that there are different states of regulations. So back to, when we started to become human, we got wired biologically to know that we had to stay with the clan or the tribe community. Otherwise, if we were cast out, we would die. So we were socialized and wired to be together. And we got that fight-flight system. And that helped us survive. Part of the problem and part of the tricks about trauma is that it gets us locked in to that fight or flight. And the fears that we once faced are not the same fears today. Now, if you're an indigenous person, a black person, a Latinx person, a trans person, a poor person, your life could be threatened any day. But for those of us that are white, we've been socialized to believe in a lot of irrational fears that drive us to do stupid things. And part of that neurology is, and the trauma that we're all carrying, is that it tends to either put us in a state of hyperregulation, where we're like anxious, angry, agitated, acting out. Does anybody ever go there? Or hyporegulated, lethargic, apathetic, don't want to get out of bed, powerless. Anybody ever go there? And what happens to us living in this culture of power over is that we're ping-ponging a lot between these places, and it's exhausting. And part of what is also happening is that, again, knowing that we were wired to be interdependent, we've been socialized by all those oppressive systems, those ideologies, those beliefs, and they're all about distancing and othering and separation. Is it any wonder that we're so screwed up? Have any of you been living with this place of discontent inside, not feeling completely whole, happy, powerful, centered, and grounded? Does anybody feel that? It's because we got set up. Because we're wired to be one way, we're socialized to be another way. But this is where we're trying to get to. So again, those spaces, and I created these new slides, so I'm got to catch up to myself. What are your strategies when you're feeling dysregulated? That's language I'm learning to take for myself. It happened to me this morning on the panel. All of a sudden, I found myself going, whoa, right, and I had to bring myself back. But what are your strategies for getting back to that calm, centered, grounded place? Anybody got any? Breathing. Okay. Deep breaths and hold it. Water on the face, that sacred element. Self-compassion. I didn't hear all of them. Painting banners, excellent. Being creative. Going deeper into community, reconnecting with people.
Self-talk. I have a spiritual reason for surviving all these near-death experiences, and I'm going to complete my task. You can't kill me or shut me up.
Yep, excellent, right? Reminding ourselves who we are. Exactly. Well, it's interesting because when I began to sort of understand these states of regulation, two things happened. One, I began to realize that all of this stuff is really essential to our organizing, right? We sort of know this, we've been doing it, but I understood it at a new level. Like if we can take, whenever we're bringing people together, and by the way, do you all consider yourselves organizers? Excellent, I see some people shaking their heads. So one of my mentors, Ron Chisholm from the People's Institute, says an organizer is anybody that brings two or more people together for a common purpose. Have you all done that? So you're all organizers. And we have to understand that we all have to be organizers, right? Because that's a key to getting people in motion. When we are living in this culture of power over and death, it's a culture of death, let's just be clear. It's really hard sometimes for people to break through that. And so that's, again, where we have to help each other and take each other's hands and go together. So the more we're all organizing, people in our family and our community, right, the more quickly we may actually get people to another place. And then when we bring people together, can we start engaging in practices, ceremony, prayer, breathing, food sharing, getting to know each other, building those authentic relationships? Because white supremacy is a culture of transaction, always trying to get something from somebody else, right? We are trying to build a culture of transformation, where that change, internally and externally, are moving us forward to something new. And when I started to look at this even more, I began to see patterns. Does anybody know what complexity science is? If I said the word complexity science?
You mean quantum physics and chaos theory?
Yes, exactly. So we don't relate to that term, but it's actually an emergence of a new understanding of how to view the world and change. It's the study of organic living systems. And when I read this, my father gave me this book called Complexity Science, The Emerging Edge of Order and Chaos. And I was like, oh, chaos, let me learn about that. But I began to see that there's a science behind why nonviolent direct action networks work. And there's all kinds of principles from individual agents in a network situation and open environments where we're gathering information and where we're getting feedback, positive and negative. Positive feedback moves us forward more, negative moves us back. There's no one strategy, multiple strategies, but there's a place called the edge of chaos. And it's that edge of chaos that is that moment, some people call it a tipping point, where something new can emerge. But what emerges, as we've said already today, is based on what's come before. So that means we have to start being really smart about how we're doing our work. Not just what we're doing, but how we're doing it. And the more we're doing our work in ways that are bringing this, because I'll tell you something, we did a lot of amazing prefigurative work in the Battle of Seattle. The convergence space, the food, the medicine, the legal support, the art, the singing, the puppets. It was amazing, and we were alive, and we were free. But I don't think we really had figured out that trauma piece as well yet. So again, as I began to look at the pattern, because fractals is a repeating pattern that, small, replicable actions can lead to a great change in any system. But the pattern I began to see here is that state of hyperregulation actually corresponds to power over and supremacy. And that state of hyporegulation corresponds to power under, which in the framework of the People's Institute, internalized racial oppression, there's superiority and inferiority. You have to have one with the other together. And so anybody that doesn't fit into the dominant mainstream will fall here. But this really corresponds to power under. But it's this space of power with and power within, which is really this space of liberation. And this is where we start getting free. Because again, we know we've all been set up, we've all been effed up, we've all been harmed, we've all been traumatized. But the thing for those of us that are white, We don't understand how we've been made sick because we're so comfortable. But until we understand that we have skin in this game, and that those of us with the most power have the greatest obligation to relay that table, we're not going to be showing up as accomplices. We might be showing up as allies, the good people. But the problem is with allies even, when you think about being an ally, what are you really doing?
I think you're exercising power over.
As an ally.
Yes.
In what way?
Because you're not doing it because you're in it with somebody. You're doing it because you think you're superior and you're doing something for somebody.
Right.
I also really don't agree that angry energy is supremacy. Because if you're queer or trans or poor or black or native or any number of things, it's a perfectly healthy response to be furious right now. So I disagree with that. I don't know about white people being angry, but I do know as a Jew, I'm really pretty angry right now. And I would challenge any non-Jew to tell me that that's supremacy. That's
I agree with you. I agree with you, actually. Because anger is a righteous force. I think what I would, and again, I'm learning, I think what I would say to this is that when we are being reactive in our anger, as opposed to intentionally acting out of it, is where it becomes into this place of oppression. Because that's part of the trick with trauma, is that when we are reacting, we're not thinking. And those of you that train people for direct action, that's part of what we teach people to do, is to get grounded, get clear, know our attention, and to be making conscious choices. Because it's a conscious choice that's the exercise of our power. And so, point well taken, and I agree with you. Yep. So, I don't, say what? I don't remember what I was talking about. But that's okay. Oh, the ally piece, right. Because so many of us, when we're trying to be allies, we come from this place of thinking like, well, we're good and we can do this and we're going to show up to help. And it's for somebody else. And it's because it's what we think we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to be. But it doesn't actually come from a place of understanding that we're impacted too, and that our liberation is bound up with the liberation of others. And when we understand that, we're actually also going to be in a place where we're going to be willing to take more risks. Hand in the back.
With the whole ally thing is allies often become part of what I like to call the white savior industrial complex.
Right.
And in trying to make it about helping people, they're setting up a dynamic, right? And it's really all about them and not the people they're so-called helping. And I see it all over the place in Seattle, you know, and it comes with so much self-righteousness. And to me, it also seems to also be a form of white supremacy.
It absolutely is a form of white supremacy. And that's the thing about white supremacy and capitalism. They're so adaptable. And it's so many layers of it, right? Which is why for those of us that are white, we have to understand that this is lifelong work of undoing. Because it is so easy, these systems snap us back in, it is so easy to continue to perpetuate it. And so again, as we think about building the world that we want and the deep change that needs to happen, it's not just in the streets, but it's really inside. And then building those relationships in that place of health. Because without that foundation, we will continue to perpetuate harm and not even know that we're doing it. So I need to move on. You know, healing trauma, some of the, I've already talked about this. So I want to just go real quickly through some of the other, what I think are the building blocks of change. What are interests? Anybody know what interests are? Who's a community organizer here? Labor union organizer? What are interests? There's
Important to you.
what's important to you, something that benefits you. We all have interests. We have interests, the people we oppose have interests. When you know interests, that's part of what you know can start moving people. So interests are, something that benefits, they change over time, but part of the art of strategic escalation and action is going through a process of making the interests of whoever we are fighting the interests of the state or our opposition, because that's when things turn. So often, generally speaking, I did this slide when I was doing labor people, often the people that we're opposing care about money, doing business, and image, right? More or less, simplistic. I like simple things, right? We often care about, well, again, I did this in a worker context. This needs to change because, yes, we fight for higher wages because we have these jobs, and I actually think that jobs are a big part of the problem. We don't need jobs. We need meaningful work, and we need our needs met. And that has been done, there has been society before capitalism. There are still societies today that don't work in a capitalist model. So anyway, we need to have the resources we need. We need to be able to feel secure. We need to be able to be respect and have dignity and be treated well. So in this dynamic of how do we create change and changing interests, we need to understand that if they care about money, we need to cost them money. If they care about doing business, we have to disrupt it. And if we care about image, all right, I haven't updated this slide. Destroy is kind of a strong word. Someone said it, expose, reveal. But this is the thing. This is the real deal. It's like we are raised in a violent culture. Like I consider myself a warrior, but I want to do no harm. But we are raised in a culture of violence. And if I was to ask you, what are some of the key dates that most people in this country would know? Right. They're all wars or violence. We don't tell the history of resistance and creativity and resilience. Right, so I just cut myself a little slack that sometimes I fall into that war language use, but I also know that there is in fact a war being waged on the planet and the people. We didn't create this war, but we have to decide if we're going to fight it, and then how are we going to fight it.
Good stuff.
So strategy, building blocks of change, interest, strategy, we need to know strategy. But I tell you something interesting to me. I grew up learning about strategic strategy, campaigns. Who is the person that has the power to decide? How do you move them? But we are in a new area of strategic change, and I'll get to that a little bit more. But so strategy is nothing more than a plan to win, and there's a set of questions. There's lots of strategic models out there that people can share with you. But ultimately, some of the biggest questions in any strategic or any organizing process is what is the problem? What is the solution? And what are you going to do? If you get those three things down, that will allow you to tell the story that needs to be told to compel people to keep moving. Because people don't move because of the problems. They bitch, they moan, they kvetch, complain. But when they feel like there is an alternative, when they see something and believe there's something else, they're much more likely to move. And so as organizers, our job is to not only be able to articulate the problem, but work with people to get a vision of the solution, and then work together to figure out what is our plan of action to change things. And in order to change things, so many things in this slideshow, too much. Okay, and I don't have a flip chart. But let me just say this. This is also a strategic tool that's called the Pillars of Support. It comes out of Gene Sharp's work. It's been used by people overthrowing governments around the world. You saw it in the Contestoria this morning, that part of the idea that people power is about chipping away at these institutions that support these systems of power over, and eventually that system will become destabilized and fall. Yeah?
Can you tell me what the handwriting in the lower right there is?
Oh, that would mean I'd have to read my own handwriting. Internal. I have no idea. Containment. Yeah, it's, okay. Internal containment internal vulnerabilities, meaning that whenever we are building particularly mass movements, there can be forces that can become problematic within us that become internal vulnerabilities. It could be provocateurs, right? So there's like, how do we deal with the fact that we're human, shit can happen, know what might happen, and then how do we organize to try and like build a container to support all that? Well, my point of being in this, I'm gonna go quickly, that really when I started to look at this for this book, I realized, okay, actually, this is kind of a simplistic model, two-dimensional, that in fact, the empire is multidimensional. It has political systems, economic systems, social systems, military or religious systems, and they're all interconnected. And if you were to look from above, you would see that web of connection. And that in any society that we want, we need means of governance, we need means of social engagement, we need economic means. And so it's not, so part of what we have to do is you don't have to throw the whole thing out, right? But you have to rearrange the deck, and a lot of it is flattening it. The other thing is, who's ever seen this kind of thing without having a set of steps leading up to it? Right? It's always on a platform of steps. And I began to understand that it's those steps which are the thing we need to pay even more attention to. And in my, if I had a piece of paper, I would draw it out, but I don't, so just imagine. The first step is history or herstory. Again, what are the stories we are telling? What are the stories that we're creating? The second step is beliefs. What are the beliefs we've been taught? Supremacy. What are the values? And then what are the practices? And I really believe that those steps form the foundation of the culture that we are living in, but they also give us the steps forward for the culture to build. So let's think, what are the stories we tell our children today? What are the beliefs that we start spreading and embodying in our work? What are the values? Take every value of the dominant culture, turn it upside down, and start putting the opposite in practice. And then the practice is so key because we are taught to work here when it's really here and in our bodies that we can actually really root different change. So let's think about that cultural transformation in addition to how we rearrange the systems. Escalation. We know that in any fight, there's different phases of a fight. Preparation, launch, battle, and settlement or victory. This is a framework that came out of SNCC, and it's understanding that we have to do our research and investigation to understand sort of all the different ways in which we're getting screwed and why we're getting screwed and how. And it's from there we then need to begin negotiation, because there's a setup here that justifies mass shutdowns. We go to our opponent and say to them, we need you to do X, Y, and Z. They either do it or they don't. If they do it, you've won. If they don't, we have to escalate again, educating, bringing more people in, doing more organizing, giving them a chance. They do it, they don't, we escalate again. We're demonstrating direct action. Sometimes, particularly in labor struggles, we get in these long-term fights. And those are the moments where we have to really decide, can we build an alternative, a parallel institutions like the people in Davis, California who fought back against Walmart by building a department store? Or are we willing to put that player out of business? Because I believe when an entity has continued to show themselves to be doing harm, we actually have to be willing to shut them down and put them out of business and not allow them to continue to operate in our community. Oh. Okay, I'm going to have to go fast. So I have this dilemma because so many of the movements today are coming out of a school of thought that's rooted in Erica Chenowitz's work, that if we get 3.5% of the population on our side, it becomes the tipping point at which change can happen. And I see the groups coming out of Momentum, a lot of them working to say to polarize the public. I want to say I have no idea what is the right way forward. If we had known, we would be in a different place. And so there could be merit and value to that, but I don't know how to just organize in that context. I think it's like, how do you merge them? Because I think when you're going to try and do major social disruption, there has to be a logic to it. And the more it is connected to the people that are profiting and doing harm, the more effective I think the change will be. So this is just a basic idea tool called power mapping. You put the company or the entity in the center, you map their world, and then every time you look at this relationship, it creates opportunities for engagement. Because I think that's part of what we're trying to do, is figure out ways to engage the people that are doing harm to try and persuade them to be doing something different. And that might be withdrawing their support for these institutions that are harming people. All those things create opportunities for engagement. I'm going to keep speeding through because I want to, and I'm tired of this now. But I will say that I have a website with lots of tools on it, but to do strategic organizing to actually stop institutions and corporations from doing harm is big, heavy work. It can also be fun, and that's what all these opportunities for engagement are. But are we entering a different era? So I really believe that as we go into this next decade, based on my life experience, based on organic living system science, that we have to totally embrace this idea of creating a crisis or organized chaos. I think that we're afraid of that, and it's part of what holds us back. The shutdown of Seattle was this brilliant, organized chaos, and it was done in a way with care and beauty. And I really totally believe that when your sort of people that are unorganized see us throwing down and putting our bodies on the line with beauty and poetry and love, they come toward us. Because people move to where they think, everybody knows this system isn't working. Even if you benefit from, you know that it's not really working unless you're the 1%. And so how do we create these moments where people come? So janitors, and now I'm going to move into pictures and short stories. So this is where I first really started learning about chaos and creating social crisis, was when I was working with the janitors in Washington, D.C., who'd been fighting for 10 years to try and unionize. And it wasn't until 94, 95, March of 95 and September of 96 that we started doing what we called Weeks of Rage, where we basically said we're going to shut the city down. And this is, so I want to just share, and I'm going to go through some of this quickly, different models of organizing. This was a model that I've replicated in many places, where you get a group of people who are committed to run with you all day long, to go in the streets, into the intersections, onto the bridges, into the lobbies, to take and hold space. We culminated these weeks by shutting down, well, we ended the first week by shutting down a bridge. We started the second week by shutting down a bridge. We ended that week by taking over Congress, Newt Gingrich, and the chairs of the city council member, all in a coordinated shutdown. And then in September, we shut this down again. And we set up a classroom on the bridge because we knew that the real estate developers were not paying their fair share, and the city was cutting budgets for schools and libraries, and that impacted the members' kids. So it was our justification for shutting it down. And you know, lots of lessons. I love doing actions where the picture tells the story. And, you know, also doing actions where you're taking the face of the person who's doing harm and exposing them everywhere. This is what the bridge looked like afterwards. When we did this action, we stopped flights at National Airport. We blocked Donna Shalala, the Department of Health and Human Services, on the bridge. They held votes off in the Senate, and then they did big hearings. They were calling us traffic terrorists. Even AAA came out as that we were traffic terrorists. So they made it a felony to block the bridges in D.C. But we learned, because we are adaptive and flexible, that you can block the exit ramps to the same effect. And some of what technology is doing is it's giving us new tools, like those Google Maps that show you traffic. You just have to study the traffic patterns and then go scout. And if you put your blockades at the right place at the right time, you can have massive disruption happen in a city. And one of the powers of blocking traffic is that the media always covers traffic. So it's like a guaranteed story. So I'm going to go through this quickly. This is a model of where we shut down DC for the day, same idea of the pillars. But this is a framework for goal that I think is really helpful when you're trying to create disruption in a geographic area. Disrupting business as usual from those promoting and profiting from war, from climate injustice, from immigration and detention. Whatever it may be, there are always people that are promoting and profiting from the harm that is being done. So our goal is to figure out who they are, where they are, how we can engage them, and how we can create a crisis for them. In this model, this was a day of action where we worked with a large coalition of groups. And what we did is we basically took a schedule where each different group had a different time, a different location, and a different tactic. So again, it was like really honoring autonomy of the different groups and not trying to force everybody into being the same thing on the same message all the time. We did a map. We did a little handout with the Monopoly board of our targets. There was a self-walking tour so people could go on their own. But the day started with a marching band in the streets. Bread and Puppet came down. The War Resisters League shut down the IRS. We had a critical mass, and even the police joined us. They thought it was so fun. Environmentalists shut down the American Petroleum Institute. We built blockades of bikes that we chained across the streets. We had giant banners. We put windmills in the streets. We had a bunch of young people. Now, we train people, for those of you that are trainers, that are wanting social disruption, you have to train people to just like go out and block traffic. Just do anything you can to block traffic if that's your goal of disruption. And so we had a bunch of young people who just like would stand in front of the cars or flood into the streets or block the buses, right? Because everything you do has a ripple effect. And if you've got enough things going on, there's rippling in all directions, it starts getting totally blocked up. Code Pink put a bed in an intersection. This was a group working around Palestine. The veterans took over the archives. This was the March of Death. Each person had a name of somebody who'd been killed. I keep thinking we could do something like this and have the names of the species on our signs. And the thing about this tactic, you can see how long it went. It literally just wove through the streets. And when you have that long of a group weaving through the streets, traffic is inevitably getting backed up. And nobody wants to drive through that. We had the grannies knitting stump socks at the VA. This is outside of Caterpillar. The students had a massive sound system on a wagon, and they'd roll it into the intersections and do Funk the War dance parties. This was Bechtel's headquarters. Folks in San Francisco drove them out. They moved to DC. This was their opening day. And the students then did this big lockdown onto desks in the middle of the intersection, again, using props that relate to who they are. We did waterboarding on the White House sidewalk. And tons of wheat pasting, big fan of wheat pasting. So again, in one day, you had all those different groups with a wide variety of tactics that all did their actions in a specific geographic zone that wreaked havoc in that zone. It was pretty awesome. Unfortunately, we did not create the crisis that was needed to end the war, but we did build a lot of solidarity between those organizations. So this was the manual I did in 2 days to try, and that was the precursor to my book. It was an effort that came out called On May 12th in New York City. And this was using that same model for a week of rage and action. We brought every different organization. Basically, they were kind of cut the teachers' job, so the teachers were the leaders in this fight, just as the teachers are leading all over this country right now with these amazing strikes that they're doing, not only for their own economic gain, but housing for the youth, like was just done in Chicago. It's like unions reclaiming their power to change community conditions, not just their own benefits. And I think that's a real lesson for us. We did all kinds of things, action agreements. We made sure that we did a whole thing of how banks affected housing, immigration, jobs, public transit, human services, education, peace. We identified the criminals, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America. What I've learned is that it's one thing to know who has the power to decide. It's another thing to know who all the people are that support them. So if you're trying to do massive shutdown in an area, it's nice to know who all the criminals are and where they are. And so that's where mapping comes in. When we started to map all these players, we learned that there was 2 concentrations, Midtown and Wall Street. So this is an example of how you might organize your information, because when you're trying to do complex actions, how to think about this stuff makes a big difference. And also, we have limited numbers of time, energy, and resources. So how do we have maximum impact with the woes that we have? So we had 50 people each day, all day long. We organized them into 10 teams of 5 people each, or 9 people each, 9 teams. We sent them out in the morning where they leafleted buildings and subways. Then they all had a little list of targets that looked like this. So each of those teams then went to a set of targets. Then 5 went to one building of 25 people, 5 went to another, and then at noon they came back all together in one location. So in one morning we had close to 70 hits of the ruling elite with 50 people. And believe me, in the same geographic zone, the ruling elite began to pay attention that something was happening. All week long, we were out doing hit-and-run actions, taking over hotels, going to key targeted actions. We had 1 public action a day so that people could join us. We led up to this with all kinds of wheat pasting from all kinds of artists. We had a whole plan coming out of it. And in the end of this, they actually did win a lot, but this is what we did on the day of our big action on May 12th, where we wanted to take over Wall Street. And I'll just say that David, who's over here, David came and helped us and built all this amazing art and organized the artists. But in New York, I don't know about how they do it here. If you want to do a march, do they want you to get a permit and do they then corral you on the streets? Doesn't that suck, right? It's so, right, so we were like, no, we're not doing that. So we mapped all the parks where you're allowed to be, and each different constituency took a park that surrounded the Wall Street area. That was the teachers. And we set all this up before we ever announced that we were doing this. So by the time the police figured out what we were doing, they're like, you can't do this. It's like, sorry, it's done, right? And what it allowed us to do is that on the day of, it was amazing. Like each of those different assembly sites, like this was the youth here, the transportation workers, peace folks at the Vietnam Memorial, the housing folks. You know, there were several thousand people at a number of these sites. Part of why this all worked, because I think this is another important piece, it's what I call permeating the collective consciousness. People have to understand there's a fight going on in your city, and that there's something happening on the ground and something happening through the air. And on the ground, what we've learned the most is that when you can choose a piece of ground on which to stand in an ongoing way, and you can keep escalating from that same ground, more and more people can start joining in, just like you saw with the Occupy movement. It's what you've seen in many of these uprisings. They're centers of power where we go and build. Agitational propaganda, key to telling the story. Election signs, by the way, you can recycle those. They're free after an election, and they're easy to redo and then put them around. And these folks taught me about what they call the tactic of the ring of fire. If you know where your governor lives, just put the signs like in a ring all the way around his house, like on all the key streets. They don't know that it's not everywhere, but they see it everywhere they go. Bridge banners, again, you drop these over coordinated bridges. It's like free, like thousands of people can see your message in one fell swoop, and it's fun, and it's sort of like you get to go out with your friends early in the morning, and it's kind of like, you know, people love doing that stuff. Taking pictures of them, turning it against them. How much he paid in taxes? 0, right? Simple ways to get in the street, using our creativity, using the artists, is a key part of creating the conditions where people are going to start turning out at whole new numbers. Bringing the arts in. So this is what I was going to show you. So this is what it looked like that day. And he did. Those cuts on the teachers, they didn't do them. He was going to cut the millionaire's tax, they increased it. Right? There were going to be cuts on child, like Head Start funding, they didn't do it. So again, you know, it's like, what are the elements of bringing together as broad a group as possible, open organizing, creative stuff? When you do stuff like this, every road to Wall Street was a mass scene of people. You don't need to do civil disobedience when you can turn people out. That was direct action. We didn't get permission. We just took the space. So, anybody know where this came from? You know, you heard the stories this morning. This took months of organizing. And that's another thing we need to understand, that sometimes we just like throw down, and you can throw down and have impact, but if you really want to have impact, you can't skip the organizing and the relationship building and the training. You know, the Teamsters and the Turtles. There's this infamous map that everybody talked about. Were you all there? Any of you not know how it went down that day? For the steelworkers, but there was also the Teamsters and the Turtles. Okay, steelworkers, great. Yeah, long-term for sure. So again, really about 3,000 people effectively did the blockade, and then 10,000 others joined in. And then it was just our mass numbers in the streets that made it ungovernable. And that's a term we really need to start thinking about. How do we become ungovernable through the people in power and the police?
Can you speak in the mic?
Oh, sure. How do we become ungovernable, right? Part of the escalation is like, we don't want to surprise each other, but we do want to surprise those that are trying to oppress us. So, you know, I talk about chaos, but I talk about organized chaos. Escalating crisis, ones that we create. We are not in control of the outcome, but if we've done our organizing well, we're going to get out to the other side. Seattle was magic because not only was there good organizing that became a pattern for the global justice movement that came out of it, it also did open up the hearts and minds of people in Seattle who saw the state violence. It also actually began the process of derailing there is no alternative for the neoliberalists. And we were winning. We shut down the FTA, the World Trade Organization was shut down in Cancun. But part of what was done in Genoa? Well, yeah, we did the G8 in a lot of places. Yeah. But Genoa was a pretty fierce war. They did a lot of harm in Genoa. But so, again, great tactical brilliance of thinking about how can you effectively do it. So again, maps are key to everything. You have to know the terrain. You have to know points of entry. You have to support people taking their own power in these affinity groups, right? Because that's actually where we had security. A lot of movements talk a lot about security culture, but if you want to do mass organizing and shutdown, security culture works against us. If you're going to do a small group action that's high risk, you don't need to talk about it. But if you want to shut a city down, you have to organize in an open way. And part of the power of nonviolent direct action is being willing to say, we're going to shut it down, which is what happened here in Seattle. People said, we're going to shut it down. There's no question about what we're doing. And by stating that, it also sets in motion a lot of other things. Now, the police made a big tactical error here, which they learned from too. There was never a major summit again where they didn't have a plan to get delegates in. And a lot of what that looked like, which we saw in Quebec, is putting delegates in hotels and then building giant anarchist-proof fences around them. So they love these fences. But even in Quebec, those fences couldn't keep us out. People actually tore those fences down. But was anybody there? Did anybody know what happened? So the fence was torn down, and it was like it opened, but nobody went. Because there wasn't a plan, they didn't imagine it was possible, and there wasn't the level of training to do that. In Seattle, thousands of people were trained and prepared so that no matter what opening could happen, people were ready to step into it. And so again, as we think about the organizing we need to do, we don't know what's going to happen, but if we build that foundation and that trust and that connection in those teams and we're ready to do it, we can adapt and be flexible to anything that does go down. Again, all this beautiful stuff. I mean, just the marches and the puppet. David, who's one of the major visionaries around this work, teaches us again and again how our puppets are not just beautiful, they're tactical. They help us take space. And I don't know, I was at, the name went right out of my brain, one of the parks. What's the park by the, we gathered in that morning? There's the Victor Steinberg Park. Was anybody there when they brought the carrots in? Right, there were giant carrots that came in. Yes, there was a tripod in them, but the police had no idea what to do with these carrots. It was like, carrots aren't illegal. But it was just, just the creativity. But then what we faced. We shut down intersection after intersection. Yes, the ministerial was delayed in the morning. Huge success, clear power. We saw people putting their bodies on the line, taking great risks. We trained people to do jail solidarity and not cooperate. Again, if we understand that power maintains itself through our cooperation, right, because we're afraid, we have to know that we take our power back by willing not to cooperate. And so again, in this history and the lineage of civil disobedience, we've seen more and more, sometimes labor unions, sometimes nonprofits, taking on the tactic of civil disobedience, but completely eroding the whole power of what civil disobedience is. Because we are trained, a lot of what those movements do, and quite frankly, for those of you with 350, the 350 action in DC around XL Pipeline, where like 2,000 of us were arrested over a 2-week period. I mean, it was awesome, and we trained a whole generation to cooperate with the police. And it was incredibly privileged. You got in, got arrested, you got your papers, you walked out the door. And if we understand that civil disobedience and direct action is sacred, and that it's about willingness to risk, we can't just undermine that tactic. And honestly, I train as many white people as possible to go to jail. Because going to jail is one of the most rapidly and radically transformative acts that people can go through if you're white. People of color go to jail every day. For the most part, people come out alive, but you don't always come out alive. White people need to, once you see what's happening in these systems, you can't unsee it. Once you lose a little bit of privilege, you know what that's about. So, but if we're going to go to jail, and we're going to go to jail in large numbers, we might also consider more and more about how do we continue to non-cooperate in this jail system as well. And that was a huge part of what happened in Seattle. Hundreds of us spent days in jail in the hope that we could get the district attorney, the prosecutor to drop all of our charges, make sure that people were not targeted, and we weren't getting where we needed to go So a decision was made to then continue it into the court system. And basically all the charges, I think there was like maybe 5 or very few convictions that came out of Seattle, but hundreds and hundreds of us walked away with nothing. And we did it again in DC, we did it in Los Angeles around the Democratic Convention, and we saw that model work again and again. But for the most part, we're not doing it anymore. And again, if we have limited time, energy, and resources, we need to get the most out of everything we do. And of course, you know, Seattle launched the Radical Cheerleaders. It launched, well, the Infernal Noise Brigade was here, but now there are marching bands all around the country and world, some even before this, but it's like, I'm so thinking we need a samba band in this country, though. There's some amazing samba bands in the streets of protests in Europe. And then we also saw the incredible militarization of the police. You know, Seattle, there's always been police violence, there's always been death, fear is fear. But what Seattle saw was the sort of coming in of this whole new generation of non-lethal weapons, which we know can be lethal. And we know that they have stockpiled. And so our movements over the past, 20 years have been facing more of this stuff. And again, all the more reason to train and build that beloved community, because people have been hurt, people have been killed, and we have to figure out how we protect each other and stay together. I've always loved this photo. That says it all. So I'm gonna just fast forward through a bunch of things. For the new movements coming up, whether it's Sunrise, whether it's 350 some, whether it's Extinction Rebellion, whether it's Never Again, Close the Camps, I really think we have to move back towards organizing people into affinity groups or self-organized groups. So many of our movements today are signal groups. Even the Sanctuary Network that came in after Trump came into power, and there's all this sort of spreading of sanctuary and, massive signal lists. These rapid response lists based on individuals showing up. And at least in Austin, when that happened, people were also trained to not intervene but to witness, which was this incredible act of disempowerment. So what would it look like if we had these lists of self-organized groups that stay together? And we know in Seattle, we have history of groups like the Red Noses that have been staying together on and off over the years since the Battle of Seattle. It's a group of people that know they can rely on each other, support one another. When they go to the action, they know that they've got what they need. When they get out of jail, they know their people are waiting. So our movements today are being trained back in that individualized model, and we've got to reclaim that collective situation of us taking care of each other and using councils. We've called them spokes councils. This is what was put in Ferguson during the uprising after Michael Brown was killed, right? We began to do, that's not me, is it? Oh, that's okay. Recognizing that spokes councils don't have to just be affinity groups, that different organizations, allies, there's all different types of clusters, caucuses, organizations, people that are organized, and that our councils can be a place where all of our movements can meet. And the power of these councils is not like there's one group making the decisions and telling everybody what to do, but there may be working groups bringing proposals, but that are actually discussed using a consensus process and deliberation, determining what we will do collectively. It's this act of direct democracy where we're not just waiting. And that's another piece today. Like over these years, spokes councils have evolved to the fact where you just have one person that goes to the meeting, when the power of it is really when the whole group goes to the meeting. Because one, then you have a lot more people in the room, which creates energy. But two, because if a decision needs to be made, the council can pause so the spokes can turn back to the group to determine what you want to do, and then you bring it back. It's an essential part. And the council, I can't tell you, like, even in Extinction Rebellion, there are a number of places that are starting to organize affinity groups, but they're not doing the council process yet. And without the council process, there's no reason for people to continue to cohere other than just doing this idea that people will just go do their own actions. But we're trying to build a movement of power. And if that's linking all of our groups together, engaging in building a culture, participating in democracy, another exercise of our power, that's going to create the strength we need to go out and to shut stuff down at increasing scales. Beautiful things. I'm going to just go through pictures. Convergence spaces are an essential thing, making sure that we have all the support we need, including, this was in Los Angeles, Democratic Convention. We had an altar. I really, you know, so many of our movements, and this is again part of white supremacy, sort of this separation from spirit, from nature. You know, I don't care, I have no advocation on any faith. When I made a distinction between spirituality and religion, it was quite liberating. But when I've been in the streets and I've watched the tear gas pouring in and we're gathering in circles or singing in spiral dances, I just watch people come, and I've begun to realize more and more how hungry people are for connection and spirit. And again, that's a part of why I think it's so essential that when we do this work, and again, I think that this is what, you know, the indigenous people are gifting us with. It's part of the lessons I took away from Standing Rock. And again, it was, you know, Paul talked this morning about understanding the power of prayer. And there can be prayerful direct action. Understanding that we're not just protesters and resistors, we are protectors of what we love. You know, understanding that what we do is sacred. And I know that this may not land with everybody, but the more we can start coming into community and just taking a time to take a breath together, to express gratitude, to appreciate one another, that can make all the difference of creating a new world. It's sometimes the simplest things that are the most profound. And let's take care of the kids. You know, I'm going to just scroll through this all. This was like, so I really believe that we are facing, the two things that we are facing most that are the greatest harm is the rise of fascism and disasters, both natural and human. And that part of our resistance is, again, not just taking things down, but building things up. And that we can start preparing now in our communities for whatever disasters will come. And I think that's an essential part of how we do this work. I was just in St. Louis, and someone said, you know, we have to stop thinking about intentional communities, but how are we in our communities intentionally? Like, how many of you know who's got a generator in your neighborhood? Right? Who's got extra water? Where do the elderly live? There's no reason why we can't start organizing now in our neighborhoods to start preparing for what can come. Because we see that natural disasters are happening at an unprecedented rate, and it's going to continue. All of this work we did in New Orleans was a movement for global justice that said, let's go to a piece of ground that's been devastated and build an alternative world. And it was amazing. We did build an alternative world, from food to shelter to pirate radios to community gardens to bike shops, and using direct action, opening up the schools. You know, these schools look like this. Within a year and a half, they look like this. All because of people's willingness to go against the police, take space, put in our time and energy. And one of the pieces I learned about disaster relief and a lot of organizing is just like moving shit from one place to another. And for those of us that are white and have access to a lot of shit, including money, we need to start giving it away, right, to people that need it. There's no reason why we can't have free stores. Like, we have an anarchist thrift store in Austin that actually, you know, every Sunday they do the really, really, really free market in a poor neighborhood, and just everything is given away. Like, we could be doing this. Buy Nothing Day, share. That just happened yesterday. It was beautiful. Woohoo. Creativity, clowns, puppets. Yarn is a great way to shut an intersection down. Dead vehicles, create ambulances, put them in the street. It's a climate emergency after all. Fire trucks, putting beds on intersections, using tools of your trade to shut things down. This is the janitors. Taking over corporate power. When you take over offices of corporate power and you do it in a simple way by bringing your lunch, then that office has the riot police. It kind of messes up their day. This is Chevron's headquarters. Shut it down. Quebec, I mean, this is Prague, using a diversity of strategies to protect ourselves. Tutti Bianchi. It was really wonderful to watch the police beat up inner tubes or barricades of balloons. This was the pink and silver block, tactical frivolity. They happened to be the only block that actually got to the convention center, and there's literally footage of police going like this because they don't really know how to deal with something like that. A radical imagination sets you free. They just don't know how to deal with all that. There's so much brilliance that people have done. I mean, even just like what the Harvard and Yale kids did by going out on the football field, holy mackerel. Again, people just taking space. I hope that replicates. So this decade began with a man in Tunisia who could no longer take the state continuing to shut him down, his ability to vend his goods, who self-immolated, which led to an uprising, which led to the change in the regime, which led to the Arab Spring, where we saw self-organization at a scale many of us had never seen before. They actually put out a little manual on how to do that. I don't know if any of you have seen this before. But they had very clear demands around the downfall of the regime, the cessation of the emergency law, freedom, justice, the formation of a new non-military government, and the an administration to deal with Egypt's resources. I know Occupy didn't really have clear demands, but I actually think, I think it's important that we say what we want. I know that like in New York City, a lot of the work around Extinction Rebellion is to get climate emergencies, and the city council did that, and then the mayor said, well, now what do we do? And there was not an answer for them. We know the answers and solutions, and we need to, if we're not going to drive with them, not drive with them, if we're not going to lead with them, we're not going to get to the change as quickly as we need. So this is the thing that I found fascinating. There were strategic goals of civil disobedience. And, you know, we think in this country a lot of civil disobedience is active sitting down, blocking things, getting arrested. But I think for a lot of these global movements, especially in Hong Kong, people see civil disobedience as going out and taking over space at a scale. And we can still be civil, but we have to emphasize the disobedience. But for the Egyptians, it was about taking over government buildings, trying to win over members of the police and the army, and to protect our brothers and sisters in revolution. And again, I can't stress enough the power of solidarity for ourselves and people that are different with us. Because if we're, you know, we talk about rebellion, but let's be clear that this is not a joke and it's not a game. If we're seriously going to contest power, they're going to come back at us, so we have to be prepared. And if we know the system doesn't work, to what degree are we willing to shut it down and take it over? So what they did is they had this little map of neighborhoods. Assemble with your friends and neighbors in residential streets away from the security forces. Shout slogans in the name of Egypt and people's freedom. Encourage residents to join. Go out into major streets in large groups to join the biggest assembly. Head towards important government buildings, shouting positive slogans. And when I looked at this, I'm like, you know what? This is a strike pull. If any of you have done union organizing, strikes, you know that you go into a work site, you map it out, you know who the leaders are, and then on the day of a strike, you gather people up, you chant, and you walk out together. And so I was like, oh, again, are we thinking about our neighborhoods in this way? Because again, if we want to have massive shutdown beyond just organized base, how do we start bringing more people in? And it goes back to, do we have the relationships in our communities where people will trust us and where we can get a sense of what they want and their vision? If we're going to do this, you need to protect yourself. This spread, Wisconsin. I'm going to just move on. This is actually the birds over the Tornillo Child Detention Center. You know, swarming is a tactic that Extinction Rebellion is talking about a lot. How do we move, take space, move on? But these were swarms of birds that came every night, and I was sure they were there to let the children know they weren't alone. In Puerto Rico, Small group of radical feminists rose up, everybody joined them, and now they're using people's assemblies to figure out how to govern themselves. Hong Kong has been one of the longest running uprisings recently. I mean, again, we're seeing stuff happen in Iraq, Chile, Bolivia. Everything is dynamic and in play. This is a fight for the future of this country. And again, continue to evolve the lessons. You know, the power of umbrellas. Who would have thunk? And you know what? We all have umbrellas. This is one of the tactics that they used, spray painting security cameras. So I know that property culture thinks is sacred. I don't believe that. But if we're in an uprising and a rebellion, I don't want to fight about spray painting security cameras. Right? We have to be serious about this because this is actually going to protect people's lives and save lives. Same thing with barricade. Well, this is again, they also knew that in any rebellion, there's some people that can take greater risks and some people can take less risks, and there's some people that can take in between. And so they set up these amazing distribution lines to make sure that those at the front line taking the greatest risks were able to be supported and get the resources that they need. They developed hand signals. If you have 100,000 people, 200,000 people, really we can't afford the sound systems that it's going to take, and we're not all going to be staying in one place. We have to be like water and move. But hand signals transcend language, sound, and are essential for their ability to communicate. Barricades, again. Barricades have been a primary tool that they have used to define space to protect people from oncoming police. And they know that they are in a fight for their lives. They are committed as much as possible to peaceful revolution. They are committed to standing in their power, dispersing, popping up in other places, instead of getting into that full-on battle. They know it's time to go and take over airports and shut them down just by being there with large numbers. We had a taste of that at the beginning of this decade. When Trump came in, there was all this amazing stuff, and then everybody just went home. I do think there are lessons about building this liberating culture, authentic relationships, healing superiority and separation, sharing power and resources, forming human networks, imagining what is possible, organizing to the edge of chaos, escalating with strategic direct action, sing, dance, play, grieve, love yourself and each other. But this September, on the 20th, I bet most of you were in the streets. We saw over 3,700 actions all around the world. We saw massive outpouring all over the world. 10,000 here in Seattle. 20,000 people here in Seattle. Okay, I'll go for 25. Imagine. But then we went home. We didn't go shut anything down. When over 1 million women marched in D.C., what would it have looked like if we surrounded the Capitol of the White House and didn't go home? We have to seriously start asking about the time, energy, and resources that we put into just going in the streets without contesting power and going home. I don't know that we can keep doing that and get to a different world because we have done this, right? I'm tired of being insane. So I have been thinking more and more that we should swarm the White House. I had put this slide together before impeachment. Some of us went to DC trying to ignite an uprising. It completely failed. But we did tap into an amazing spirit of people that were like, this needs to happen. And Frances Fox Piven has taught us, and she said to us, you have to try again and again and again because you don't know at what moment it will take off. What I know is that incumbents usually win. The electoral system is rigged. Democrats are completely capable of losing on their own. And if we, the people, don't become the real counterforce that we are, knowing that protest can change the course of an election, it can change how people move, if we don't figure out how to take the streets in a radically different way, I am terrified about what could happen in our future. So I want to just end with this little groovy video because I like it.
Children, we don't have much time, but let's get right to it. It's the end of the world. Somos personas normales y corrientes. Somos como tú. Estamos preocupados e indignados por el panorama político, económico y social. What is going on?
There's a lot of ways to take space.
I am not protesting, and what I do is give people again hugs. What you need is a hug.
There's been more than one time in history when clowns have brought down governments. It's classic David versus Goliath. Small and light.
We transformed our naked body to instrument of women's fight.
If you refuse to leave, you won't be arrested.
There's never been a movement where people haven't had to go to jail. So the question, are we going to jail on their terms or our terms?
That's ultimately the only way we can really fundamentally change the world that we're in, is to rethink it. And you can't rethink it if you think in old ways.
We will keep revolutioning. We will never stop.
Creo que puedo cambiarlo. Sal con nosotros. Es tu derecho.
I mean, people all over the world are rising up. And we have risen up in this country. We've risen up right here. And we changed the world. Extinction Rebellion is calling for massive social disruption, understanding that unless we really are able to create that social crisis, that the governments are not going to enact the radical programs that are needed to change the course of climate destruction. Somebody just said they've got sign-up sheets here. People want to learn more. And we know that many of your other organizations have been throwing down hard in this city, including 350.org, Sunrise Movement, Red Noses. Lots of people have been doing this. I want you to know that I've really screwed up because I thought my workshop was over. But I think there's another hour. And so I jammed through and cut a lot out because I thought I was like time, but we'll figure out what we want to do about that. But does anybody know about Decolonize This Place? This is a movement coming up in New York City that I think has been building a hybrid that I think is totally exciting and revolutionary. It's all led by people of color. And they have been doing actions at the Whitney Museum trying to remove Candor because he was tear gases, and they won. Well, when the police started cracking down in the metros, they've done 2 actions in the streets of New York City now. And I know some people won't like this, but basically it's fuck the police, which again creates cognitive dissonance for some folks. But they have been jumping turnstiles, doing these mobile tactics, and it's really amazing the energy in that it's building. These global uprisings, we don't know the outcome, but we know that conditions will change, and that when we rise up around small things like metro fares, they're not small things, we can change those things. So maybe what I should do is just see if there's We can open up for discussion. We can actually also do some small group work, talking about what kind of organizing in here in Seattle could you all begin to imagine of what could take place, more deeply rooted in solidarity, anti-oppression, where you actually cover each other's backs. So we can look at that. And or we can also wrap up early so people have some time and space before the closing. But let's start with questions.
You have some wonderful slides that we rushed through. Is there a way we can pass around a way for us to give you our emails and you can just email us those slides?
On the Shut It Down Now website, there's a place where you can sign up. And some of those photos are actually on the Organizing for Power website, which is a resource for trainers and activists. And I actually have a number of slideshows under media loaded up on there, from global justice movement to Hurricane Katrina to Palestine. So there's lots of slideshows there.
Thanks a lot for your talk. I was going to ask you about what do you think about blocking streets? Not only blocking the 1% or like WTO protests, but we are blocking people who are just kind of citizens in terms of building movements, antagonism. I mean, it's a very common tactic. You shut a lot. What do you think about the positive and negative of it?
So I think that when we were blocking the streets and the bridges of ordinary people, it was part of an escalation where we were telegraphing through the stuff that we would be shutting things down. And we would say in the media, we're going to be out in the streets again, blocking streets and bridges. Like if you don't want to get caught up, you might not want to drive through this area. So we're telegraphing that so people know. We also made sure that we let people know that if they got stopped in traffic and they were angry, that they should call the mayor or call the people in charge, so that we're hopefully taking their anger and channeling it to who we want to move. So, just one off of blocking a street, I don't know what it gets you. It's like good training, it might be fun, but it's like it has to be part of something bigger. And again, this is where I'd say we have to be strategic. So in DC, when Climate Strike did the shutdown of 22 intersections on September 23rd, they did awesome work. It was a coalition of groups, including Extinction Rebellion. One of the people who was talking with me beforehand said, oh, we're going to shut down Highway 295. We're looking at shutting down 295 and 395. And I'm like, why would you shut that road down? Oh, because lots of people come in that way. And I'm like, do you know that that is the only way into DC from Anacostia, which is the poor black neighborhood? Like, why would you do that when you have all these other roads where the rich white people come in from? Right? So again, we have to be strategic. It's just like in the UK when people got on the train of working class people, right? We can't pit ourselves. We have to be mindful of who we are impacting. But we also have to be clear that, this idea about saying sorry for the inconvenience, we have to work on that. In Hong Kong, they, said sorry for the inconvenience. It was in the photo, but we're fighting for our life. In DC, on that same climate action, somebody like 3 days before put a flyer to give to the traffic that, again, apologized for what they were doing. Black Lives Matter, which was a part of the coalition, said, we have a hard block on this flyer. Somebody else was like, this is coming in too late in the process. And both Black Lives Matter and this other person was like, we definitely don't want this on coalition letterhead. So what happened is they took off the coalition letterhead and used the flyer anyway. But the Black Lives Matter folks basically were saying to them, do you understand that when you do this, you are dividing our movement and putting us at greater risk? Because we are unapologetic. We have to shut stuff down. And when you put this out and you say, we're really sorry, you're trying to be the nice protesters, which will then make us the bad protesters. And as it played out, which was more a fluke of the geography, but the folks that locked down to the boat were cut out and released, and the Black Lives Matter protest, which was on this overlapping jurisdiction between Capitol and all, as soon as they went in the street to do health care, the police moved in on them. And white accomplices stepped in and were the ones primarily arrested, but there was this complete disproportionate and disparate treatment of those two different groups. And so that led to a discussion that had to happen afterwards, right, to get us all back in right relationship. So I'm all about shutting down streets, But I like to do it as part of an escalating campaign that's telegraphing the message, that's doing it more than a one-off, and that's building pressure throughout to a much bigger shutdown. In the back, and I see.
I know everybody is waiting around the world for what this country's going to do about, we have the most dangerous regime in the world, a fascist regime. And so many people are upset in this country, but they are very quiet, and it's got to change. And, you know, here with the WTO, it's a tremendously inspiring thing, where people from around the world actually came to the U.S. to help join the protest. And I was in D.C. the next year. And there was so, you know, it was a tremendous thing, standing up for the poorest people in the world, and the U.S., you know, on their heads. So I think we're all faced with this challenge where people are just waiting and waiting. I mean, there's definitely people out there that are making big sacrifices and trying to disrupt people's normality, but there's a huge accommodation to this, and some people deny that we're under a fascist regime. And this has got to change much sooner than later. So I don't know if you want to address that, but it's kind of the elephant in the room for all of us. And we have to put aside differences to come together in a cause that's much bigger than all of us, which is what the WTO was, and I think that's why there was so much joy in the streets that we came together. So I don't know if you want to address that, but it has to be addressed. It's a real thing, the elephant in the room. So.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I do think the rise of fascism is one of the greatest threats. I think it could lead to open warfare in this country in the next decade. I think it's possible. I hope it doesn't, but I think it's possible. So I agree that it's serious. And if, again, we learn from history, if we don't challenge it sooner than later, it can be too late. But I think one of the ways for us to challenge it is for us to do the unlearning work of how these systems are working through us and how we are working with other people around us and dealing with our families as well as our friends who may not see it yet. I think it's also part of the strategy around community preparedness and defense that I also talked about. How are we organizing to protect our communities now for what might happen? Because it's in that organizing process that our relationships will build, trust will build, right? And that when stuff goes down, we know how to protect one another. And I think it's also in this piece around really understanding solidarity at a whole new level. So I mentioned earlier about how we did all this undoing racism training in Austin. What that has meant is that when, not long after the Muslim ban, when the Muslim community wanted to do a rally at the Capitol and were afraid because the year before a guy with a big gun came and took the stage, over 2,000 people turned out in Austin, linked arms 3 rows deep, and created this huge human perimeter around the Muslim community so they could feel safe and secure. When the police contract came up, the whole community came together. Hundreds of us spoke out. We defeated it. When they tried to move this land bill, we all came together across all the movements, stood together, defeated the land gentrification bill. When they tried to criminalize homeless, we all came together, stood up, and it was defeated. And because part of what had happened, we were building that network, the net that works to hold us all, where we're showing up at those key times. And I keep wondering about, you know, the Pledge of Resistance. I grew up in that model. It's, again, this affinity group network model, spokes council, same thing as the WTO. I keep wondering, like, and it was fundamentally an emergency response network. And I keep trying to think about what would happen if our communities had these solidarity tables or councils that were made up of all the different movements, and that all of us signed up as a pledge to show up and turn out in whatever was happening in self-organized groups, so that if a black person is shot by police, we take the leadership of that community, we all go, right? If ICE is doing a raid, we look to the leadership of the immigrant rights community, we all go. If homeless are under attack, we look to the people who are working with unhoused folks, we all show up and go. Because right now, we are so busy struggling on our siloed issue and so overwhelmed and so exhausted, and so we continue to fight in all these ways that are separate, and so then we never have the collective power of all of us together. And that's what the WTO was. I knew there was a movement, it was an incredible movement, because people from every movement showed up there. So instead of just waiting for these like historic moments, like how are we doing that organizing now to, again, undo the socialization of oppression, build the tables and networks of solidarity and showing up together. Because I think that, you know, again, whether the disasters are fascist, state police, or climate, we can be prepared.
Nothing's going to change unless we stop them.
Yeah, everybody's trying, and I mean, so I'm gonna just keep going because there's a bunch of different hands. Go ahead.
We have a long history, well, not a very long history, I guess, of using the general strike as a very powerful tool. I don't think we have enough experience to really understand the power of it and how to organize it. I'd be interested in your comments.
General strikes are really hard because from the heyday of the giant strikes where millions of workers were organized, labor law has put all these conditions on unions that basically really stop them from going. And so you think of strikes as a tactic of labor, where when we're putting our hopes on labor to do it, other than like contractual fights, like we've seen the teachers or the food workers, I don't believe we're going to see that. But when we look at what the youth have done around the climate strikes, the leadership around that, I would say, how can we learn in the climate strikes where the real power of the labor strikes have been? Because the labor strikes were not just the power of walking out. It was the power of disrupting that company's ability to do business and a willingness to stay out as long as it took to get the change at great hardship, which meant then the community needed to organize to support those workers. So walking out is awesome, but it's not enough. How are we then strategically impacting those economic powers, and how are we building the community to support the people that are taking those risks?
Does it become a question of the leadership?
Oh, the leadership's always in the way.
Leadership is
Yeah, I mean, forget it.
corrupt as all get out.
Yeah.
But within the unions, there are agitators, resistance people who could lead their shops, their unions into a strike.
Yeah, and there are, like the IWW, there have been wildcat strikes and walkouts, but like, I'm just trying to be based in reality. So I think that, and we saw this in Seattle, let me just say this. The unions thought they were like the big gun. And the nonprofits were like, we're the big ones. And they were working for reform, and they wanted to make sure that workers' rights were respected and environmental protections, and that's all good. But they like really distanced themselves from those of us that said shut it down. But when the people rose up and shut it down and changed that thing, they all then wanted to kind of become friends, right? They wanted to figure out, because they understood there was power there. And so they began a process of building those relationships. So I would say, just like everything else, it's like if we are demonstrating our power and being effective at it, just like Occupy. Occupy was a scraggly gaggle of young folks that like threw down. But when they did it and it built, who came knocking at the door? The labor unions, the nonprofits, right? They all started to show up and start giving resources. And then, instead of continuing to fuel that resistance, they started to co-opt it for their fights. And some of that was good because I believe inside, outside. But what happened is that it eroded some of the radicalism because it all got channeled into more mainstream organizing. So I would say it's like, don't rely on the unions, but know that a lot of workers will show up when it's needed. I think there were some hands back there. Go ahead.
I was just wondering if you could tell us some successful or not successful tactics that you've seen in interrupting white supremacy or toxic masculinity in like the longer term organizing. Like let's say you're trying to shut down a city, and so you're working with a lot of different groups with a lot of different identities, and you're trying not to have dominant narratives prevail in how you're organizing this happening.
Yeah, short answer and a little bit of a longer answer. I mean, when we were working around the shutting down the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles in 2000, it was on the heels of Seattle and the critique about where were the people of color in Seattle. There was a big discussion, and so we had the Direct Action Network there was committed to doing anti-racist organizing. And one of the things we did is we created a set of principles to guide how we would be in relationship to one another. We had little practices where whenever we had meetings, we all get like 5 poker chips, and every time you spoke, you put one in, and when you were out, you couldn't speak again. You know, there's things like progressive stack that prioritize voices. So there are lots of like techniques like this. I work with a group in Austin called Undoing White Supremacy Austin, because we know that there's some long-term organizing that white folks need to do to undo this socialization and to become more aware of how we are enacting white supremacy. So that's a longer-term thing, but it's enabling us to build a network of white folks that will show up in a good way. You know, so actually one of the speakers at yesterday's panel, when talking about this, particularly around patriarchy, you know, she offered this piece that I thought was very wise. And what is her name? Do you know the Latinx woman on the second panel? Jessica Hernandez, because I want to be able to credit people where they're due. She said, you know, she wanted to particularly say to white men and young white men that every time you think a thought about something, take a pause and really reflect about how your thinking is working. Because again, it's like, you know, there's a setup. And we have to and that setup is to just react and go. And we actually have to pause to really think about what we're doing and saying. And again, for those of us with more privilege, whether it's male, whether it's wealth, whether it's white, part of our job is, you know, sometimes I hear us say, those of us that are white, you know, it's our job to lift people up or to whatever. And it's sort of like, really, our job is to kind of get out of the way. There's a way in which marginalized communities, they don't need to be lifted up. They just need us to get out of the way and to listen and learn and to show up humbly. Because we need to we can't just go away. We can't let guilt and shame stop us. But we have to re-examine our relationship to the center and power. And we don't need to give up our power, but we need to hold our power in a way that's accountable, that's not reactive out of trauma, and where we're really working with this notion of consent when it comes to other people's lives. We can't assume. We need to ask, what can I do? What's needed? And then using the resources that we have to try and show up with what's needed. But we can't assume. So I don't know if that's helpful at all, but it's a bunch of different things. But what I do know is shaming people, calling them out in the moment, just polarizes even more. So I like a nonviolent communication, which is like, oh, I noticed this just happened. This is how I felt. This is actually what I need because this is what happened to me, and will you do this? It's a simple 4-step process that's not about judging, because that's the other thing. Judging, criticizing, all that's white supremacist shit. Other hands? Right here?
So I know like you getting arrested can be like a really hard topic because it can impact kids' futures a lot and it can give them like, I guess, a lasting trauma depending on what happened. So I'd like to know your perspective on having kids get arrested and how you can really like
So kids getting arrested, I have a practice with young people of never telling them what to do, but sharing my experience and making sure people have the information and supporting them making choices. Depending on your age, you always have your parents to deal with. Because one of the things we know with minors in particular is that minors get separated from everybody else, and there's a different process that you'll be engaged with. And you can't be released unless it's with your parent or like a guardian that's signed paper. So young people are no different than anybody else in the sense that there needs to be training, there needs to be information, you need to understand where you have power in your choices, what are the consequences of the choices that you make, and then you need to make a decision about what's best for you, most likely with your parents, right? Because you don't want to create unnecessary trauma for your parents either. And then we have to also begin to make sure that if we are adults and we're working with young people that want to get arrested, how are we building a really strong container for them? And not just being outside the jail where the adults are being held, but how are we outside where the children are going to be released, right? And to really honor that act. So, I mean, it's like, it's a conscious choice, it's a sacred act. You have to decide for yourself what makes sense for you. And, there is power when anyone that is vulnerable, whether it's by age, race, gender, class, when people are vulnerable and are still willing to put their bodies on the line, it can do a lot to move people who may be watching. And the other thing I would say is don't ever do it alone. Go with a bunch, right? And then like raise hell in jail. No pizza, no peace. Any other questions in the back here? And then I see you on the camera back there.
Kind of more a question about the Occupy movement and that format of the General Assembly. Kind of felt like it was a format that was kind of a layer of maybe judgment, that was just a space for for people to kind of talk through our traumas, and didn't really have a good space for making decisions or coming to identifying goals and things like that. So if you have any reflections on that, as that process and that format, and I guess also that wondered if you'd be interested and willing to go back to some of those slides you had about the spokes council model and how to organize movements and movements and that kind of thing.
Yeah, Occupy made a lot of mistakes. And one of them was thinking that the General Assembly process could be the forum for all kinds of small and big decisions. And because part of the training, because I always say to folks that have a history of political organizing, particularly in direct action, when new movements emerge, we have to show up and help. Otherwise, we're setting people up to learn the hard way and repeat some mistakes. So one of the things Occupy did is they didn't understand in a consensus process, at least in New York, that there was a place called stand-asides. It was either consent or block. So there's lots of blocks. Lots of decisions were brought to the assembly, which was being done at dark. They were doing this kind of thing, which in like a couple thousand people sort of doesn't work. So, and they were missing the piece of getting people into self-organized smaller groups. So, and then when they began to create a spokes council, I'm only speaking about New York right now, I don't know how it went down here. So in the spokes council, some of them had concerns about bringing in different organizations or groups, and so they set up the spokes council to be exclusive. You could only be in a spokes council if you met these conditions, which meant anybody that didn't meet those conditions came in like holy hell to blow it up. Right, so we don't have to be very careful about building exclusive models when we're trying to build a mass movement. But we have to also really build good agreements and boundaries for the container, so that if people come in for whatever reason and are disorganizing us, we can actually deal with that disorganization. And one of the things that I've done a lot with consensus is I basically try and put some conditionalities on blocks, that if you haven't come to the past few meetings, if you haven't been a part of this conversation, if you haven't raised your objections in the discourse process, you can't block. Because that is an abuse of power, and we're trying to like all learn how to use power responsibly and accountably. You know, the thing with affinity groups, you know, it's that fractal model. Small groups of people who choose a rep or a spoke, who have a conversation in a council. The basic idea behind it is, let's say you have 1,000 people in your movement and you bring 1,000 people into the room, it's really hard to make a good decision. But if those 1,000 people are organized into 100 affinity groups, and the decision-making is in the council, then you have 100 people. It's a lot easier to make a decision with 100 people. Another one of its premises is that within that 100 people, your issue or concern is likely going to be raised by one of those 100 people. And if it's not, then you tap on your spokes and say, would you please bring this into the discussion? So it's a way to work with large numbers and make it manageable. So one of the things I've been talking about Extinction Rebellion about is like there's these two models. There's the working groups who have their own organizers hub, and that's finite. It's like those are the groups to build the infrastructure for the movement, medical, food, process, trainers, etc. But affinity groups and the spokes council can be infinite, because as it gets too big, you can start to divide. So in New York City, they've been using neighborhood groups that they're trying to shift to spokes council. They can have the Brooklyn Council and the Bronx Council and the Staten Island Council. And then in this concept of networked organizing, you know, it's sort of same model, but just federating. So then you can bring the councils together. Like Extinction Rebellion, same thing right now. We have a national spokes council, but it has like 50 groups on a Zoom call. That's pretty hard. We're trying to imagine more and more if groups could organize in their region and develop a process in their region, then the council at a national level could be representatives of all the regions, right? So what you're trying to do is like make sure that decision-making is pushed down as far as possible, but it's built in an accountable structure that makes it manageable. So I can maybe go back to those slides, but let's see what else is alive in the room. Oh, I'm sorry, I'll get you next. Go ahead. Prioritize youth. I'll get you next. Go ahead.
The momentum strategy of movement building, which I know like influenced Extinction Rebellion and Sunrise, and I was wondering like if you could say more about your ideas about momentum.
I mean, what I'll say is that like I'm open to learning and seeing what you all make happen. My concern has always been is that when I see a presentation of the theory of change, which is that there are these trigger events that create whirlwinds, and then we absorb, and there's a cycle. I agree with all of that. And I sometimes feel like, but where's the organizing? Where's that relationship building? Because what I have seen is that the government, in response to the movements of the 60s, really helped infuse the creation of the nonprofit complex. And what we've been seeing is that nonprofits have sort of taken over the space of where a lot of social movements used to be, because we got the jobs, and then we mimic the dominant culture, and then the staff know best, and then they can just direct people where to go. But the problem is that the nonprofit also have resources and boards, and then they get scared, and then they need their branding, and then they have to compete for the money, right? And so we just get all messed up. And so, and lots of concepts, like nonprofits are also really good at creating sort of sanitized versions of how we do things. And movements are messy. That's part of why they're beautiful, if we can stay committed. And so in particular, the theory of change rooted in that 3.5%, how I hear people talking about it, but that doesn't mean they're doing it, is this notion that our goal is to polarize people to create the conditions. And what I've liked to do is to do strategic fights against key targets that create the social disruption, that does polarize people, but they know it's about these targets and what we want them to do. I think on climate stuff, it gets even more complicated because moving the government is different than moving the corporation. And what we also know on climate stuff is that people have been fighting pipelines, they've been fighting corporations, they've been fighting for the rainforest for a lot of decades, and we haven't changed it yet. So I feel like you all who are new and coming up need to like go with what you're doing and trust your heart and see. It might work, it might not work, but you're going to keep learning. And again, I don't think there's one way over another way. That's why I keep thinking more and more like, how do we bring these things together more? How do we have that's one reason why I spent probably more time than I should have on these building blocks of change and tools, because I want people to see some of what has been learned before about how do you like organize strategically to actually create social disruption. Because again, if we think that we're just going to have an uprising and everybody's going to come out, I don't know. I hope. I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah. Okay, you've had your hand up in the back a lot.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about something that I saw that I sort of wonder if anybody else in here saw. And that is, I was at the big day of the tear gas and all that stuff, videotaping and everything for the IMC. And then my batteries were all dead and I was out of film. So I was walking home and I walked on Westlake, over to 5th Avenue. And right there was a Starbucks. I don't know if you guys remember that Starbucks. And right inside, I saw these so-called anarchists in there tearing up the Starbucks. They were breaking in and entering. And they were in there tearing it up. And it was right in front of the cops. So right over across the street on Fifth Avenue was a whole line of cops. And I was walking right in between them, but I didn't have any film or anything, but I was kind of a little bit antsy because there they were, and there were the cops, right? And so then I went home to charge up my batteries and get some more videotape, and I was going to come down and tape the debate with Michael Moore and Ralph Nader, right, which was at the town hall. But I didn't know where the town hall was, and I parked it down by the Jazz Alley. And so I was going to walk up to the town hall, and I didn't realize the convention center was there, right? So that was surrounded by cops. But I walked past the same group of maybe 10 or 12 so-called anarchists that were just spray painting and breaking glass. And then I walked up to the cops. I was going to ask them where the town hall was. And none of them would talk to me. They were just like, you know. So then I just turned around and walked past and walked right past those same anarchists. And then I said something. I said, well, you know, you guys break glass, we get our heads busted. And then one of them just like came up and said, oh yeah? You know, and so then I shut up. I had all my cameras and all that stuff, so I just didn't pursue the point. But my point was that later on, I figured out those weren't anarchists, okay? Because they weren't tearing up the, you know, the Old Navy or something. They were just spray painting local businesses and defacing bricks and stuff like that, brick walls and stuff. And they didn't move like anarchists. They were a work crew. They were just going from one place to the next. And so it hadn't dawned on me at the time that they were provocateurs. But I have never changed my mind since. I'm positive that they were agent provocateurs because it was the next day that they used the property destruction to declare martial law. And we all know that the martial law was illegal, and they got sued and had to pay $3 million, but that's nothing. See, if they hadn't declared martial law, we would have shut the WTO down for a whole week. And so, you know, I kind of don't like the black bloc anymore, but I know that those weren't black bloc, those were cops. And so I wonder what you think, if anybody else saw that. Because just that, I know there was other property destruction, but you know, this was a small crew. I think they were doing most of the damage. They were just going from one place to the next all day long.
I mean, there's no question that police show up or that there are agent provocateurs. You know, the black bloc, which is a tactic that is vulnerable for infiltration. We've seen around the world how police dressed in a certain way break windows and go behind police lines. And we know that there are people that really are committed to a strategy of defending themselves and also enacting cost to property and corporations. So I'm not going to get into, you know, there's this historical debate in our movements around what's violent and nonviolent, and that also has torn our movements apart. I'm really not interested in that discussion. I'm really interested in, like, what is the third way forward? How do we stop glorifying property? How do we stop dividing each other? You know, after the shutdown that was not as successful in Washington, D.C., we began to develop a set of movement agreements. You know, we actually pulled together some labor folks, some religious folks, and some anarchists, black bloc anarchist types. And basically we're like, okay, we don't really like each other and agree with each other, but we're going to be in the street and we don't want to be divided. So what do we need from one another to be in the street together? And that included things like don't turn anybody over to the cops. Don't talk about anybody else's tactics, only talk about your own. Don't put people at risk with your tactics that haven't chosen that risk, right? So there are some ways that we can hammer out agreements on how to be in relationship with one another without being unnecessarily dividing or, you know, being part of the state's effort to criminalize us, because they're going to criminalize us all, no matter what your tactics. And so, you know, that's why on the Hong Kong thing, I'm like, let's not fight about building barricades, or let's not fight about spray painting security cameras. I mean, we have nothing to gain by that. So, I mean, I know that I'm committed to nonviolent resistance. I know I'm committed to putting my body on the line, and that's where I go. And I also know that if I try and talk shit about people that are choosing different strategies and tactics, I'm not going to have any basis of a relationship or trust to work together and build relations in the street. Because if you marginalize somebody, right, there's no basis really for engagement. And so, you know, again, whether we like certain things or not, we are not in control of everything. What we are in control of the relationships that we have, the agreements that we have, and then engaging in an accountability process on those agreements and learning every time we go through. So those are just some of the ways I've chosen to work in this milieu of difficulties.
There are several people in this room who were working building the WTO shutdown by June. I was a latecomer. I didn't get into it until September. A whole lot of preparation went into that. Meanwhile, the Black Bloc, according to some of their key activists, did their preparation separately with the intention that they would do their thing to our thing. They were taking what we had constructed and using it for an entirely different purpose. One of their purposes, just for example, was that they wanted the police to attack us so that we would get beat up and we would realize that you have to fight the cops. That's not a direct quote, but that's almost a direct quote of what I was told by them. In situations like that, it's really handy for them to say, oh, nobody gets to talk about anybody else's tactics. Nobody gets to criticize. You all get to do what you want to do. When their direct intention is basically to steal from us, to come and take away what we built.
I mean, there's been sectarian organizations that still exist that try and co-opt our movements all the time.
No.
So yeah, there are. But what I would say, I have a different story and understanding of what happened then, which was that actually an agreement was made that a lot of the smashy wouldn't start till later in the morning, specifically so not to put the nonviolent blockades at risk. And that's kind of how I remember it actually going down. Now, that's not to say there weren't other people doing different things at different times. When you have a mass movement and a lot of people showing up, you know, there's lots of different ways that we engage. And so part of it, you know, again, there's a lot of toxic movement behavior. There are a lot of unhealthy dynamics that play out, from patriarchy and supremacy. I mean, there's a lot of bullshit, and let's be real about that. And it's killing us. And so, again, I can't change people, but I can really work to try and build accountable and relationships of integrity, and also be clear about our boundaries. So it's sort of like if we have these agreements, nonviolent agreements, if this doesn't float your boat, this is not your action to come to. Go do your own thing, right? So, but what we had in Seattle was the emergence of what then became the peace police, of people trying to stop people from doing things, and it just became a mess. That's like a no-win situation.
Well, one of the things that we tried to stop people from doing was violently attack other people in the protest.
Yeah, no,
Black Bloc people who were not police were attacking people.
So
I know I was attacked. I know I dragged a Black Bloc member off of a woman who he had pounded to the ground.
So I hear that you're still angry. I have been in a similar situation when people have tried to light a bus of workers on fire, intervened. When people feel afraid, I have intervened. I got called to peace police too once in my life. I'm about doing no harm. So again, I think it's about building that culture and being clear about what we're doing, and then also being organized enough to de-escalate. And if we have to put our bodies in human perimeters, by, you know, because again, I'm not here to judge. I don't know who they are or what they're doing. But I know that we have a lot of damaged people who are very angry, and that what they know right now is to sort of fight back. And maybe they'll learn and get to a different place. Maybe they won't. But we are all in the streets together, and so how are we going to continue to build our movements? And I just don't believe that marginalizing them, I mean, yeah, we can be clear around boundaries and even in the streets. But yeah, I mean, it's just like there's no, yeah. Third way. Okay, any other right here?
If you could say more, you showed us a slide where you said it was really about workers and jobs and
yeah.
organizing for higher wages. My fantasy about climate strike is that it leads to general strikes where people decide, I can't go back to work because I'm poisoning my family. So could you say more about what you were indicating was work that needs to be done rather than jobs?
So one of the powers of the organizing for the WTO, and I think it was in the contest story this morning, you know, it was like, do you care about air? Do you care about water? Do you care about food? Right? Tapping into people's basic interests is part of what we need to do. Is helping people understand like what is happening impacts their basic interests. And then there's a piece of agitation, right? So much of our communications these days has gotten dumbed down to focus groups and let's just tell the story without the agitation, and we need to agitate people and have that plan to win. So again, I don't completely have any answer for what's really going to work other than doing the hard organizing, having the conversations, helping people to have access to information if they don't have it, working with people to make sure there's plans, sometimes with little steps, but then making sure that the action we do is meaningful. Like I remember we did an action, you talked about failures before, where we did this action and it had people taking risk, but it didn't have any impact because there was a flaw in the plan. Like, and so if people are putting themselves out, taking a risk for something that's not truly going to have an impact, and they get hurt, it's really easy to lose people. Like we have to like really be serious about what we're doing and that the hope that what we are doing is going to have an impact, which is also why I think on these general strikes, that, yeah, if we could get massive general strikes or people walking out, yeah, that would stop the machine and would force them to change. So I will hold that vision and we can keep organizing to that, but just like we were saying earlier, so just getting everybody out for one day that marches and feels good and goes home is not having any real meaningful impact other than the internal, I mean, yes, there's media, and yes, it's good, but we're not materially changing the conditions other than for a new generation feeling their power, which is important, but can we get them to a place of power and having successful impact sooner, right? Because that's really what's going to radically transform people.
Let me ask you two quick questions. One, where you talked about hunger strike, and the other one is, we live here with Boeing, and everybody flies a lot in Seattle, and the whole culture, nobody wants to look at Boeing because most people love Boeing, and it seems like it's an elephant that's right in our city, and I'm not sure the tactic or the thoughts about how we actually, they just came up with a new program to create planes to fly themselves because they know they're going to make people flying in the next 20 years, they won't be able to train those pilots. So can you just, whatever your thoughts are?
Boeing. Shut it down. I mean, Boeing is a target where if you were to do some research and really map the power holders, the boards, all the relationships, you could put a strategic campaign. Obviously, there has to be a piece of organizing with the community and the workers, right? Because you want them with you, not against you. And part of it is like, what is the cost of Boeing to their lives? It could be airport shutdowns, right? Where their planes are flying in and out to expose them. So I feel like these are some of these entities that can, when we go after them, can create a crisis and potentially polarize the public to move them in the direction, but you have to make sure that you're telling the story of how Boeing is bad for all of humanity, and that even if the workers are unionized, that it's not enough, right? So I think there's a whole piece there, but it would be like doing one of those full campaigns and a long-term organizing process that's building to some crisis for them. In terms of hunger strikes, I've personally never been a fan of hunger strikes, but you know, they have their place and everything else. I think that, you know, people have done them in jail. I want to keep my energy. I mean, I think during the 1980s, some veterans did a hunger strike, the Fast for Life, where they went for like, I think like 50-something days, and it was really powerful. I know there was a more recent hunger strike that XR did for a certain period of time. So again, it's like, there's no right or wrong, good or bad. It's like, does it make sense in the moment? And are you going to like honor the tactic and get the most out of it? And so if people are going on hunger strike, I think it's most effective when you choose a piece of ground, you're there again and again, you have a big support community around you, build some more publicity and events around it so that builds and builds and builds, so that the sacrifice that people are making becomes a story that can hopefully move people. Because it's really about, yes, every tactic is like our personal transformation, but we're trying to move people to take greater risks and do more. So hunger strike at Boeing after an escalating campaign, I don't know. What time is it? Okay, so I don't know what time does the next piece start, is it 4? Okay, so we'll take a few more questions. Any other, I see a certain group of people, but let me ask, are there any other young folks in the room that have questions? Go ahead.
I have a question about youth movements. The movements I'm a part of are come out of the Momentum organization, and it's a lot of youth-led movements around polarization. And I'm curious how a lot of questions about that. One piece of it is how you think about knowing your history and also understanding that the leaders of all social movements have usually been youth-led, and that dynamic. And one thing I'm seeing of sort of like how young people are learning from their elders as a cognitive dissonance with rejecting the world that our elders created.
Well, there's a way in which we did create this world, but we're not in control of all of it. And I do think intergenerational work is essential. I'm not sure I completely understood what the question was you're asking me.
The question is what do you think a healthy model of intergenerational organizing is, in a way that honors history and also honors the need for youth to be at the forefront?
Again, the term that comes to mind is what is right relation? It's knowing that the youth have to make decisions for themselves. They have the power, the passion. We need to get out of the way, those of us that are older. But we also have to watch their back, share our wisdom and our lessons, but just not tell them what to do. I mean, I've been in many actions with young people, they don't listen to me, and they go do stuff, and some of it didn't work out for them. But that's okay, they learned on their own, right? So I think part of it is like knowing we can't do it without each other and we need each other, but we have to be in right relationship, and that's, respecting and honoring all. And for those of us that are older, which is a certain amount of privilege there, to sort of stay out of the way. Like when you look at the uprising in Hong Kong, it started with students around the National Education Plan and then grew to the umbrella movement. And for the longest time, it was like, where are the adults? Where are the adults? And then finally the adults started showing up and acting on their own. So we shouldn't wait, as Reverend Sekou said about people that showed up in Ferguson and all these other groups and religious people. Like when you show up, keep your mouth shut, but say, I'm sorry it took me so long to show up, right? Because we all have skin in this game and we have to show up.
Could you talk about the value of fun and friendship and a little bit of romance?
Kiss behind the barricades. Thank you. I love that. If we're not having fun, if we're not having joy, if we're not singing and dancing, if we're not sharing food, if we're not using our creativity, we're missing like half the boat. Because this world is hard, this work is hard. That's one reason why Seattle was so successful, because it was brilliantly creative and spectacular and amazing and otherworldly and fun and radical cheerleaders and giant whales and trombone players and right, and what? And artwork and giant puppets, all that stuff, right? It's essential. It's what feeds us and fuels us to keep going. If it's just like the resistance and the dreary part, and even though it's like it's got to be melded, not either or. When we were just in D.C. around trying to instigate around removing Trump, we were out with these banners, Trump lies, arrest Trump, the impeachment clause. Again, it was like did not get us what we wanted. But at nighttime, we were out on the street with our like honk signs and banners, and all of a sudden, the horn started, right? And there was this cacophony of resistance. And then we realized, oh, we don't need to just stand on the sidewalk. We can go out in the crosswalk while they come up. And then we can dance between the cars with our signs. And it became this amazing fun. And more people kept coming and coming. So fun is attractive, right? It's what fuels us. And again, that's why I like the self-organized groups, because you got your peeps, right? And you can work together to bring creative interventions into the mix. So, yeah, Emma Goldman said, if I can't dance, it's not my revolution, right? So there's a party tonight, you can go dance. And then we're going to go create art in the street after this is over. Everybody can go.
So Zoe had asked about young people risking arrest. And so any young people who are interested in learning more about direct action and civil disobedience, there will be a youth-oriented direct action training on December the 15th, coming up soon. It's a Sunday. It'll be in Burien. If you need help getting to Burien, there will be rides organized and things. There are flyers upstairs on the sort of tables at the various groups' tables that have information, or just come to me and give me your contact info and I can send you information. It'll be from 1 to 6 in Burien, and the priority really is young people. So if you're over 25, then we'll have some more later for the older of us.
Is there a bottom age limit?
14, I believe. But again, you could try earlier, but priority is 14 to 25.
I think Lisa will be the last person to self-promote, but I do want to mention once again that she does have a book out. It's available. Okay, it's available here, and there's also a book reading this week. Maybe we could get her to talk a little bit about it.
It's going to be this Tuesday night at 3rd Place Books, Seward Park. Seward Park, that one. And 7 to 8, thank you. I hardly know what I'm doing. I'm careening through. So thank you for the local organizers on that. There'll be books there. I appreciate that. And they're gone over there. So if people got a book, I'm still happy to sign them. I think that instead of taking more hands, I want to just begin to wrap this up. And one of the things that I like to do as we explore anger and fear, it's also sort of an exploration of love. And actually, hey, David, do you want to say anything about what's happening tonight and any help that you need? Do you want to announce more about after this is over? Okay, here.
Why don't we wait till everyone else comes down?
No.
We can do it
You
both
want to do
ways.
both things. Hearing things more than once is good.
We thought, a bunch of us thought it would be appropriate to actually commemorate shutting down the WTO by doing something in the streets together. So one thing we're going to do is we have Jim Page, who's going to sing a few songs and lead us in Shut It Down, Didn't We? And we're going to do it at Pike and 8th, directly in front of the Washington State Convention Center that we shut down a few minutes ago. And Ali, who sings with 350.org Seattle, is going to lead us in a few songs. And while that's going on, Jill Freeberg and I collaborate, and we're going to do guerrilla projections of photos, art, and she's gone through 400 hours of footage and picked out the best, most heroic stuff, no one getting roughed up by cops, us just being heroic. And we're going to project it on the convention center using an outdoor guerrilla projector. And then while we're doing that, something that people have been doing increasingly around the country is taking over streets and doing non-toxic street murals. So we're going to do a little street mural. Rick, would you be willing to get the drawing on the cart? And so we're looking for as many hands as possible so we can just quickly and peacefully take over the street and just make a non-toxic statement in the street. So it'll be super fun. We're going to, I think, at about 5:30 walk over from here. And we need as many hands as possible so we can peacefully hold the street for just a bit.
Enlarge this.
Thank you, and let's give David a round of applause, too, for all of his work, for many movements over many decades. showing us how to throw down with beauty and love. So it's been a great teacher of mine as well. So in just closing, again, gratitude to all of you. Appreciate those of you on the streets in Seattle helping to shut it down. Appreciating those of you in the streets today who are leading the way for a new world. And as you go tonight and get up and get ready to move, with consent, if there's somebody nearby you that you would like to offer a hug or ask if they'd like to receive a hug, just give each other a hug on your way out. It feels good, and we need each other. But ask consent. Thank you all. Appreciate you. Much love.